Thank you, John, and thank you to the university for having me here. And I am a local, so I didn't even have to travel. Pretty cool. What I hope to do today is share some data about my father and show you some of his works and hopefully inspire you to do your own great things, whatever they may be. So, Harry Bertoia was born in 1950 in Italy, and he grew up in a small village called San Lorenzo, which was about 50 miles north of Venice and not too far south of the Dolomites, the mountains. And this was the actual barn where he lived. And after school, now they only went up to about 5th grade back in rural Italy in those days. So then he had to do chores, but he always wanted to find pencil and paper and draw. Just from the get-go, he loved art. And luckily, his parents realized that, and they sent him to a local art teacher in the next town over. But it was within just a few months that the teacher came to the parents and said, look, this kid is really talented. I've already taught him everything I know. You need to send him to some kind of art school and help him pursue his passion. So indeed, they gave him the choice of either going to Venice, which was close by but very expensive. And at that period, they were having a drought in Italy, like we usually do here in southwestern Utah, except for today. Or he could go to America, where his brother, Oreste, was already established. So you can see what he chose to do. He went to Detroit, where Oreste was living. This is Oreste, here's Harry. Harry was 15 years old, so he was an innocent teenager. He didn't speak a word of English. He had never used public transportation. He had never eaten a hamburger. He had a lot to learn. So he went to what they called the Americanization school for 6 months, where they give you a crash course in English and a smattering of American history. And then he actually went to an elementary school for a while to catch up. And then he went on to a high school and even an arts and crafts school. But the next major step for him was getting a scholarship at the Cranbrook Academy of Art, which is still in existence. Has anyone been to Cranbrook? Okay. Well, it's a prestigious art school, and now they also have science and lots of other topics. But it's just outside of Detroit in Bloomfield Hills. And back when Harry attended, there were only about 40 students. So it was a very intimate, and even today they only have 80 or 100 students. So it's an intimate and prestigious school. It was here at Cranbrook that a lot happened for Harry Bertoia. I think his first guardian angel was Oreste, his brother, who realized that Harry was quite talented, and he had said, look, I'll support you, I'll feed you, give you room and board while you pursue your education. It's important for you, Harry, to go all the way. And coming to Cranbrook was, perhaps it was fated, who knows if destiny is a real thing, but there's so many great artists out there. Well, how does one artist make it? I'm sure art students all over the world ask themselves this question, and hopefully this presentation will answer some of your questions. So at Cranbrook, he began to learn various techniques in art. One was in printmaking. These are samples of monotypes, which are unique prints. They're made similarly to a print, but he only made one at a time. So there were never editions of 50 or 100. And the ones made at Cranbrook, we're looking at the 1940s now, were very colorful and art in their own right. And the foundation actually has quite a few of these, hundreds of these. So that was one thing he learned. Then another thing he was able to perfect was his jewelry making. And Harry found that he really had an affinity to metal, all kinds of metal. He loved to use gold because of its malleability and its luster. Silver was good too, but he used everything. This one is bronze. This one's also bronze. This one's silver. So all the jewelry he made at Cranbrook was handcrafted, simply with hand tools, hammers, pliers. He didn't learn to weld until about almost a decade later. And it was here at Cranbrook that Harry met some very important people. We've got Charles Eames. Smoking was in those days. Charles Eames, who's heard of Charles Eames? Okay, a few of you. Well, he kind of did everything. He was an architect. He made some really innovative films. He designed some furniture. Just a very creative guy. You'll always hear about Charles and Ray Eames. And Ray was not his brother, it was actually his wife. So, and then we've got Saarinen. Now, the director of Cranbrook at the time was Eero's father, Eilio Saarinen. They were a Finnish family, and Eero was an architect, and eventually Harry and Eero collaborated on several architectural projects. We've got Florence Schust, and she was an orphan, and the Saarinen family essentially unofficially adopted Florence Schust. They called her Schu from her last name, her maiden name. And she ended up marrying Hans Knoll, Knoll, who had a furniture company, and they were instrumental in Harry's career as well, that you'll see in a few slides. Now, Harry you can see why Brigitte, my mother, fell in love with this guy who's a pretty good-looking young man. And Brigitte Valentiner, she was instrumental too. I'm telling you, all the stars aligned for Harry Bertoia. Brigitte was the daughter of Wilhelm Valentiner, who was an art historian. He had come from Berlin, and again, with World War II approaching, Valentiner saw the writing on the wall, and he sent for his wife and daughter, Brigitte, to come to America because he could see that Hitler was kind of a wacko. So Brigitte came over here, and she really didn't have anything to do. She was 19 years old. She had left a boyfriend back in Germany. So her father pulled a few strings, and he got her entered into Cranbrook for one semester. Now, she had, love you, Mom, but she had very little artistic ability. And I got to go to Cranbrook and look at their archival records. The reports for Harry Bertoia were, oh, this guy is incredibly talented. We wish there were more hours in the day that he could do more. And then you'd see Brigitte, very disruptive in class, refuses to follow instructions, no artistic ability. But nevertheless, they got together. They did get married right there at Cranbrook. So the next step while they were still at Cranbrook, was the Museum of Modern Art in New York decided to hold a contest, a competition for organic design of furniture. Now, you have to think about the era, in the 1940s, when most of the furniture made was wooden and angular, and so here they put out this word for, okay, let's get some organic design here. Well, the chair that won the chair competition was this piece here, and this was actually made out of molded plywood, which was a new material at that point, and they had to cut out this hole because all those compound curves just wouldn't work right, and there were unsightly folds and wrinkles in the wood, so they cut that hole out to make it a little bit easier, and then they upholstered it to cover up the blemishes as well. Nevertheless, they won the chair competition, and part of the prize was to give them money to figure out how to mass produce this object. So the pair who had come up with this design was Saarinen and Eames, who you saw in the last picture. And actually, Harry helped make a few of the smaller models. It was a team effort, because you can imagine 40 students and just maybe 10 or so instructors. They were all like a family. And think back to your own university days, or you students, you can think about your life right now. You're going to class with these people, you're eating with them, you're partying with them, you're doing everything with them. You get pretty close. So with that chair, the Eames, Ray and Charles Eames, decided to move to California, and they actually invited Harry to come and work for them, which was pretty handy because by this time the war was imminent, and they discovered that Harry had come in on a visa for Canada because his father was working in Canada at the mines. So Harry was in the country illegally, and they were about to deport him. But luckily, Charles Eames decided to hire Harry, so that was kind of the saving grace. You know, if you were an immigrant that was needed for a particular job, then you could stay. So Harry and Brigitta moved to California. They had little Lesta right there in Santa Monica, and that's what California looked like about that time. So they helped with the chair design. They had to do some war work in the meantime. Who has seen the Eames leg brace that they made hundreds of thousands of? Anybody? Okay. Well, we won't go into that story, but that fascinating story there too. So this chair was what came out of that one. Now you can see it's quite different, and part of that was due to Harry Bertoia's ingenuity. He realized that because of the molded plywood and all those compound curves, he said, look, let's just separate the back from the seat of the chair. So they did that. It made a lot of sense. Of course, when Harry took one of the models and cut it in half, Charles Eames was having a fit about it, but it turned out to be the right thing to do. And then this metal framework, Harry was a metals man, so he came up with that. And even these rubber grommets, which at that time they just got from an auto parts store, it allowed the seat to move and give with the seated person. All those were Harry's ideas. So the understanding was that when the chair was introduced to the public, everyone on the team who had contributed to the design, and there were probably 10 or 12 folks on this team, they would all get credit, their names would be mentioned. Well, the chair came out, and it was known as the Eames lounge chair wood. There was no mention of anybody else, and Harry Bertoia got a bit miffed, and he quit. He quit the team. So, okay, here we have Florence Knoll again, Shoe. And now they didn't have Twitter or email or Instagram back in those days, but they had postcards and phone calls. And Shoe heard that Eames and Bertoia had split, and he was struggling. My mom told me how she was selling her German jewelry to buy diapers for Lesta, my sister. So they were having a hard time. Well, Shoe comes along, and she invites Harry to come and work for the Knoll Furniture Company. Now, they were in Pennsylvania. They had settled there because the Pennsylvania Deutsch people were hard workers, and they were able to find a lot of laborers who had a good work ethic. And you can just see one of the original Knoll trucks, and Shoe at her desk. This was the home that, after a couple of years, Harry and Brigitta finally moved to this house, and that's where I grew up, not too far from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So, and my mom loves to tell the story of how they actually moved. Shoe had sent the letter inviting Harry to come and work for them. Harry wasn't really good at making quick decisions, so here are the letters sitting on the kitchen counter for a week, 2 weeks, and Brigitta's thinking, oh, come on, let's go already. So she decided on her own to answer the letter, and she said, oh, Harry's very busy, but he wants you to know we accept your offer and we'll be coming to Pennsylvania soon. And then Harry gets the postcard in return from the Knolls. Oh, this is great. We're so happy you've accepted the offer, and we'll see you soon. And he looks at Brigitta like, hey, what happened here? And she says, oh, I told them we're coming, and I just forgot to tell you. So there you go. So indeed, Harry went to Pennsylvania. Got to make sure I'm on track here. And he began to work for the Knolls, and they assured him that he would get full credit for anything he designed for them. This is Hans Knoll, who was Shoe's husband. So we've got Herbert Matter here, who designed all these great posters. He was their marketing guy. Hans and Shoe, and here's Harry looking dapper. I want you to notice this sculpture that was on the windowsill of Hans's office, because that's called a multiplane sculpture, and that will come into play a little bit later. So Harry worked for Knoll, everything was going great, and ultimately, after a couple of years, the Bertoia collection for Knoll came out in 1952, and it was a smashing success. And that furniture collection the mass production began in 1953, and it has been in continuous production since that time, which is almost unheard of in the furniture world. It's just like fashion. You know, you've got bell bottoms in the 70s, they disappear, and then you've got flares in the 2000s. This one's trying to escape from his still position here. Okay, so the furniture came out, and then Harry no longer worked for Knoll. He had done what he promised to do, but it got his name out into the world, the Bertoia collection. And they gave him an option. He could either take a $20,000 lump sum that would buy all the rights to the chairs, or he could get a royalty for the rest of his life. Well, as a young man with a growing family, he decided to take the $20,000, and I think at times he sort of regretted that, but really it was the right choice, because that stone house in the past picture. He was able to put a down payment on that, and it gave him a little bit of a buffer to get into sculpture, which was what he really wanted to do. This asymmetric chaise lounge was designed at the same time in the 1950s, but because of its asymmetric nature, it was just too hard to mass produce this thing. They didn't have AutoCAD or any computers to do that. So it actually only came out in 2005 after one of the prototypes sold at a Chicago auction for $119,000. Well, Knoll noted that, and they sent one of their guys to get all the specs, and then they began to produce the chair. This is just some historical pictures. My brother Val, that's me when I was still cute. And there's Lesta, my sister. And, you know, little kids just like cats. They find the comfy places. That was the asymmetric prototype. And again, just another archival photo. It was a good childhood. I grew up out in the country, virgin forest. I used to run around barefoot all summer long. And my father was a workaholic. He wasn't home all that much, but when he was home, he was very present with us. And as a little kid, I knew that I was loved. You know, children know things, and he was a good dad even if he wasn't there. He didn't come to school activities or football games or anything, but he imparted his knowledge and his love. That's all you can ask. Okay, so you remember that little sculpture that was on the windowsill in the Knoll office? Well, when the chairs came out, they had a big opening, and they invited lots of designers and architects to come to see the chair designs. And Saarinen came and saw all that. Plus, he saw that little sculpture. And he called up Harry. He was in the middle of doing a huge project for General Motors up near the Detroit area. A big campus, General Motors Technical Center, which became kind of a groundbreaking industrial complex. But he saw that little sculpture. He called up Harry and he said, "Do you think you could make something like that, except make it about 40 feet long?" And Harry said, "Sure, why not?" So he did, and that was the result. It was his first major architectural commission. And this set him off on a pretty amazing career of being in demand by architects, making all these monumental sculptures. So here he was, just barely in his 40s, and he was already a successful artist, making his entire living from art. So again, you think about all the steps. Now, Harry was an incredibly hard worker. As mentioned, he was hardly home. He'd go to work in the morning, come home for dinner. We had dinner at 5:30 every night. Families ate together back in those days. And we'd have these wild conversations about the universe and philosophy and where were you before you were born. And then he'd go back to work around 8 or 9 o'clock and work till midnight. And sometimes his helpers told me later, they'd come in at 8 o'clock in the morning, and there's Harry in his clothes from yesterday, his hair all tousled, and he'd been there all night. He just lost track of time, and his creative juices were flowing. So, as mentioned, he went on to do all these incredible monumental pieces. This one happens to be at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Has anyone been to the MIT chapel? No, okay. Well, if you're in the Boston area, I highly recommend going to visit this. And by the picture, you can see, okay, that's kind of cool. But honestly, I had seen hundreds of pictures of this piece. But when I went there in person, you walk into this building, and this happened to be another Saarinen architectural piece. And the chapel is round, and it's got these wavy walls. It's an amazing building. And you walk in there, and there's kind of a hallway that leads to the actual chapel in this area. And you just want to take your shoes off and start whispering. I mean, it feels sacred the minute you walk in there. And I get chills just even thinking about it. And I wanted to show you this lane from the Bertoia property in Pennsylvania, because you can see it's got a similar lighting and attitude, the light from above. And Harry was very much influenced by nature. I mean, we always had art books on the coffee table, and we had lots of art around the house, but it was nature that was his biggest influence. Some other monumental pieces. This one had its first home at the Philadelphia Civic Center, but that building was placed there in the 1960s, and that building was ultimately demolished around 1999. So they put that huge, monstrous sculpture in the police stolen car warehouse, because they didn't have any place else to put it. So it sat there for a while, and I finally discovered its whereabouts. So we coordinated with the Woodmere Museum, which is just it's in Philadelphia. And after about 5 years of finagling and political nonsense, we got the sculpture to be replaced there at Woodmere. So it's back in Philadelphia in public view. Now this one, a similar style, is in Buffalo, New York. You can see the texture here. These sculptures were made with simple copper tubing, as you might find in a residential house, just plumbing pipes. And he would heat them to malleability, curve them to the desired shape, and then take a bronze welding rod and weld it to the last piece. So a very time-consuming a process. It took about 9 or 10 months to make that one, and this one took even longer because it was a little bit larger. So Bertoia was really one of the first artists who took industrial materials, plain old copper pipes, and used them for artistic endeavors.
Celia?
Yes?
How big was that sculpture?
Oh, this one is about 14 feet across and something like 12 or 13 feet high. And this one, I think, is something like 18 feet wide. Thank you for asking. Yeah, feel free to ask away. Okay, now this, similar to this little guy, except this one is, I believe it's 20 feet tall, and that's in Huntington Gardens near LA. So if you happen to be going on a road trip, you're going to the beach out in California, you could stop in Huntington and see this one. It's pretty magnificent. And this one, you could stop on your way because this is in Palm Springs. They affectionately call it the Peacock. And it's at Sunnylands where all the presidents go. And it was commissioned by the Annenbergs, a family who had a home in Palm Springs and also one in Philadelphia. And this one was commissioned for the University of Pennsylvania Performing Arts Center in Philadelphia, again by the Annenbergs. And you see the pictures and, okay, it looks kind of interesting. But again, if you see it in person, this thing spans 3 floors. So it's something like 40 feet tall. And when you see the whole thing, it's pretty amazing. And you can just barely see up here. It hangs from one hook. And you better believe the engineering had to be exactly right for that thing to not fall. You know, it was pretty darn heavy. Harry had the artistic abilities, of course, but he was also very scientifically oriented. He read Scientific American magazine. He was interested in black holes. Black holes were just discovered in maybe the 60s or 70s. When he was going to ship a lot of sculptures somewhere, he would line out how they would all sit on the flatbed truck. He'd have a diagram. Okay, this one has to be this way. So when you're an artist, well, it's wonderful to be creative, but you have to have those other skills too, and you've got to get the bills paid. He was his own secretary. And if anything, sometimes he would pay bills twice because it happened to come across his desk twice, and he just, rather than look it up, he'd just pay it. This was an iconic photo. This was actually in Playboy magazine in 1961, which for you youngsters, you may not know what Playboy was, but it was a gentleman's magazine with scantily clad women, and they had an especially beautiful, very scantily clad woman as the centerfold. Well, I call this the other centerfold. It was the hotshot designers of the day. And if you take a design class that has anything to do with furniture, you probably will hear these names. George Nelson, who created the Herman Miller Furniture Company. We've got Edward Wormley. They're all with their respective designs. There's Saarinen with his womb chair, a fabulous, comfortable chair. Harry Bertoia in his diamond chair. And there's Charles Eames in his LCW. Now, this was the first time that Eames and Bertoia had seen each other since their little falling out, and I hear it went okay. And Jens Rissam, Scandinavian designer. So, and they had a fabulous article that went with this photo, all about modernist design. And again, as mentioned, Harry was very much influenced by nature. This one almost doesn't need words. I mean, you've got nature, and then you have Bertoia. You might think of metal as this cold, hard substance. But you look here, and it looks like this fluffy little puffball that you could just touch and make your wishes. And this too. Now, he didn't necessarily try to exactly replicate nature. He would take what he saw in nature and interpret it in his own way and then make it in metal. So somehow he was able to capture the essence of that beautiful organic plant and make it with metal. And even his workers later on, when I wrote the book and was trying to get all this information, they said that Harry was such a skilled welder and metal worker that there were certain things that only Harry could do. There were plenty of things that the helpers could do, repetitive tasks, but there were certain things that no one else had the skill to do. Again, nature's red rocks. And this was before I lived in Utah. And Harry's bronze. The bush series, he made lots of what we call bushes. And just like in nature, he had a stem and these branches that would, fractal nature, they split again and again. And again, with this kind of concentrated, dense branches, Ed Flanagan, one of his helpers, said, yeah, it was just impossible. Harry had these huge farmer hands, too, that you can't even imagine how he could make these delicate little pieces or how he could reach his hand into the small space. let's say he made this thing, and then he's got to finish the last few branches. Well, how do you even get in there and with his torch? What's that?
What are the size feet?
Now this one was larger. This is about 3.5 feet. This one's probably 20 inches, and this one's just maybe a foot tall. The largest bushes he made were maybe 4 or 5 feet. And you can imagine, with all those branches, it would take him 6 months to make one bush. Now, a smaller one would take maybe just a few weeks or a month. But Harry did not shy away from difficulty or technique. If he had a vision of what something should look like, and there was no technique invented to make it, well, he just figured it out and made it anyway. Then we come to the sounding sculptures. He had a barn. We had a barn in our Pennsylvania home that he remodeled and made into kind of a concert hall. And he started experimenting with these tonal sounding sculptures, just like this little guy. And he made them in all shapes and sizes. You can see this one has cattail tops. Some just had reed straight tops. And he put about 100 of these in that remodeled barn. And he made recordings. He would do these concerts. So he had to come up with a name for the recordings. So he actually called it Sonambient. And this was something we sat around the dinner table one night, and we were trying to come up with a name for these sounding sculptures. And we were throwing out all kinds of crazy things, but Sonambient was the one that stuck, and it was sound, and ambient environment. So really the term, Harry's idea, was the sound environment created by these sculptures. And he made a lot of these, thousands of these tonals. So when you see them go up for auction at an auction house, Sotheby's or Christie's, you'll see them calling it a sonambient piece. And that's kind of a misnomer, because he really only meant for the collection in the barn to be sonambient. It was the whole group of them together that created sonambient. But it's okay. So this was the barn, and it was really an incredible experience to go in there. Now, I was a teenager when he had this at its peak. He said he called it his laboratory, and he would, in the first few years, he would experiment with this grouping, and then he might take out one and put in a different one. And he said, yeah, it's like a family. You take one out and put another one in there, and then there has to be an adjustment period. All the others have to get used to this new tonal. I mean, he talked about these sculptures as if they were his children. And honestly, sometimes I think he knew his sculptures better than he did know his children, but it's okay. He was here with a mission on this planet, and he accomplished it. The concerts that he gave were really incredible, and we do have recordings of them, but it was something, you can't really call it music, but it was sort of this harmonious, universal music, perhaps. And then he might hit the gong, and that would make a huge, thunderous sound. And then we've got little singing bars here that would touch and make another kind of pinging sound. And those of you who are local, and I'm assuming most of you are, you have the opportunity to come to the Harry Bertoia Foundation, which is local, and you can get a little taste of this. We don't have 100 pieces, but we have enough to give you a good flavor of it. We were trying to find a museum home for that Sonambient barn collection. And we tried our darndest for about 5 years. We had Sotheby's helping us. But it's not just like buying a painting and you just need 5 feet of wall space. For these sculptures, you had to have an acoustically sound location. You needed people to play them. And we did have to get some money for them to support the foundation. So we never did find a home for all of the sculptures, and we still have quite a few of them. But we decided to sell about 20 of them at Sotheby's, just to the highest bidder. And this was one of the displays at Sotheby's, and it was kind of a frenzy, the sale, because people had been hearing about, this an ambient barn collection. And when it finally came up for sale, collectors just went wild, and we broke a lot of records that day. Bertoia has been exhibited all over the world. The most recent exhibit was at the Nasher Sculpture Center in Dallas, Texas. This is the catalog. This dandelion is gilt, gold-plated, and the gold-plated dandelions are just incredible. They are so beautiful. Of course, I'm the daughter. I'm a little bit biased, but they really are great.
And how tall are most of these?
Oh, thanks for asking. Yeah, this one was about 7 feet tall. They ranged. Some of them were just little, 3 or 4 feet, and the largest dandelions were 10 feet tall. In the 1964 World's Fair, which some of you oldsters might remember, the Kodak building had an array of gold-plated dandelions, and it was just an amazing array, and I think that's where a lot of people were introduced to Bertoia. This is another one of those multiplanes, and that one, as you can see, is about 10 feet tall. This was at the Nasher, and someone took a picture of me there, and I felt like I was just communing with my father, who's been gone for many decades now. That photo kind of went viral on Instagram. So this is the Bertoia Foundation Gallery. We're just over off Snow Canyon Parkway. These are some of the tonals we have there. And a lot of the speakers who come for this forum, they're coming from all different parts of the country, and they have expertise that's amazing. And I moved to St. George because I love the outdoors, and I love the sunshine. We moved from Montana, where the winters get kind of long and gray. And when I was we were searching for a new home, and thank goodness for the internet. I could put in there days of sunshine in this city. Well, St. George won, so that brought me here. So we opened up the gallery just a few years ago. But you don't even have to travel to New York or LA to see Bertoia. You can come and visit us. We're mostly open 10 to 4 weekdays. Although I'm kind of a one-man shop, so it's good to call before you come. And this picture, I just like it because it shows the relationship of my father and myself. We were sort of, in some ways, two peas in a pod. Now, I'm not artistic at all. I'm the organizer. I write lists and have sticky notes all over. But we had a similar energy, and you can see we're about the same size. He was not a large man. I'm 5'6", and that's about the size he was. Of course, he had a lot of muscle, and he was built like a bulldog. He was so strong, his helpers told me that at the shop, there was an anvil, a big metal thing that you hammer tools on, and it weighed probably 300 pounds. Well, he would pick that up like it was a cat and just carry it around the shop. I mean, the guy was pretty incredible. Anyway, when I was a teenager, this was probably when I was maybe 18, and I was the least likely person in the family to have this role. But again, I think things just sort of lined up. I was the black sheep of the family, and I'm sure you university students, you always have the good and the bad part of you sparring inside. And I gave in to that bad part sometimes and did some naughty things. But I straightened myself out, and now I feel like I'm doing my life's work. I love what I'm doing, and it all worked out. This was another huge gong, and this one is about 10 feet diameter. You can see the little kitty cat down there for perspective. This was a gong that Harry erected before he died, but we decided to make that his grave marker because we just thought it was appropriate, a large gong for a large spirit. So that's on our property in Pennsylvania. And we've got the foundation. You can contact me. I've got some business cards here. And I see we should start wrapping it up. So please ask any questions. And I thank you.